Secretary Miguel Cardona, thank you so much for talking with us today. Gosh, the Department of Education has been front and center. And I wanted to talk to you because I'm not sure everyone knows exactly what the DOE does. So, can you explain for people watching and give us the abridged version
Sure,
about what your department actually does and what its function is?
of course. Well, first of all, thank you for doing this, and great to see you again. I really appreciate having the opportunity to share with you something I love, education. I've been an educator my whole life, and what is the federal role of education, right? Our job really is to ensure that students across the country have access to quality public education. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about what we do actually, but what we do is just make sure students' rights are protected in education. We ensure that there's funding for education too. Congress passes legislation on funding where we ensure that it gets out and it gets out fairly, and that the laws are being followed in education across the country. We're only about 10% of education funding. The other 90% is state and local. So it's not as large a role as people might think. The responsibility of education really lies on the state. I was a former state commissioner of education, so I had more responsibility there, ensuring education in the state. But the federal role is to protect the rights and ensure that there's funding for for education in the states.
Talk about some of the programs that you all fund. I know programs for kids with disabilities, for
Right, right,
example. That is a very important role for you. Other assurances that kids are going to be treated fairly
right.
and not targeted. Can you talk about some specifics?
Sure. And one thing I have to warn you, there's a lot of acronyms and abbreviations in education, so I'll try to not use them. But
Thank you.
you mentioned special education. There are over 7 million students in the country that have been identified as students with disabilities. We provide the funding for a special education across the country. And we make sure that it's followed, that the funding is used to provide support for students with disabilities, and that it's not used for something else, right? Um, there's Title I funding is something that 26 million students across the country benefit from Title I funding, and Title I funding is really the equalizer. There are many communities, whether it's poorer communities in cities or rural communities, that benefit from funding to help equalize the fact that maybe the local property taxes aren't enough to provide an adequate education. So the federal Title I funding helps equalize that. We oversee that. We make sure that those dollars go out. We make sure that communities that are set to get Title I funding in a rural community in Kentucky, for example, get those dollars, and those dollars are used to give students an opportunity to learn. We oversee that. We oversee the federal student aid offices, which provide millions of families access to federal aid dollars, so their children could go to college and reach their goals. So we oversee that, and we make sure that those dollars make it to those households so that those students have access to college. And then you mentioned the rights of students. We have an Office for Civil Rights that ensure that the laws are being followed across the country, whether they're children with disabilities or children who maybe don't have access to classrooms or to free public education. We ensure that states are doing what's lawful in terms of providing a public education to their children.
Talk about disability programs in particular, because I heard a lot about that during the campaign.
Yeah. I'll go back to when I was a school principal. One of the best jobs I've ever had is really just being a part of a community where children receive the support that they need. And in the school where I worked, we had children with autism, we had children with Down syndrome, we had children that had speech delays. And it was our responsibility to make sure that those children had the support that they needed, whether that was a paraeducator to support children that needed the support, assistive technology. There were children that couldn't speak, but they could communicate, but they couldn't speak, but they could communicate well if they had assistive technology. It was our responsibility to make sure that they had those tools in front of them. And the IDEA funding that the federal government provides ensures that those students have that. And it's also our responsibility at the federal level to make sure that schools like the school that I was leading back then, followed the law, making sure that those children had access to those devices using federal dollars, right? So that's our responsibility now at the federal level to make sure that the 50 million children in our K-12 schools across the country have access to what the law says they should have access to.
And why is that so important in your view? Have you heard from individual families, Mr. Secretary, about what these programs have meant for their children?
Absolutely. They're life changing. Honestly, it's the difference between a parent being able to oversee the education of a child with exceptional disabilities, or a parent saying that I cannot support my own child. Katie, it's about a child reaching their God-given potential, regardless of the disability, and not being defined by a disability. We have so many students in our country that are doing amazing things that are not being defined by their disability. This allows us to make sure they get the support that they need. And in many cases, it's really about making sure that children could learn in a regular learning environment and not be shipped off to some school where they don't want to be, an hour away from their home. They get to stay in their communities because the schools are giving them the support that they need right in their local community. That's critically important for families.
And that funding comes from the Department of Education, not from the states.
Correct. So the IDEA, the states do put a large part of it too. I don't want to discount what they do, but the federal government, when originally passed, said they're going to pay for 40% of this under IDEA. And IDEA stands for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Well, the 40% that Congress committed to, we haven't really done that yet. We're increasing it, and under President Biden, it's increased to its highest levels, but we still have to continue to fight for that federal funding at the federal level. But without the federal funding right now, which is about 14, 15%, students in the local level wouldn't have access to a lot of the supports that they have. So, that is critical funding. You'll hear parents coming to DC talking about the importance of that funding. Educators realize that if it's not for the federal funding in IDEA, students with disabilities wouldn't get the support that they need.
I know that you oversaw the nation's efforts to safely reopen schools, Secretary Cardona, after the COVID-19 pandemic. That seems to, in retrospect, have been the source of a lot of anger and frustration by parents across the country, not the reopening of the schools, but the closing of schools.
Right,
And I
right.
wondered if you could address that, because I do think that perhaps has contributed to some of the anger towards the
Yeah.
federal government.
Yeah, no, totally. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to that. And I'm going to speak to it not only as a Secretary of Education, but as a father. I had two high schoolers who in 2020 were forced to have their education disrupted also. I was Commissioner of Education in Connecticut at the time. So let me be very clear with your listeners. It was during the previous administration that schools were closed. Day one, I was sworn in on March 2nd, 2021. Day one, my first message was, we need to reopen schools quickly and safely. When I came in as Secretary of Education, over half of the schools in our country were closed, over half. And within 9 months, we had over 97% open full time. So for me, we worked to reopen schools safely, and we did it. And part of the reason why I became Secretary of Education is because President Biden noticed that in Connecticut, we opened schools quicker than other states, and we did it safely, and we did it in partnership with the medical community, with parents. So we were able to do that successfully there. When I came in as Secretary of Education, we quickly reopened schools. But again, I'll be very frank with you. I think it became a talking point for people that were frustrated with the country's reopening. Our schools opened quickly when President Biden took office, and we're proud of that.
Why do you think that so many people blame the Biden administration for this then?
I think there's just general frustration over the pandemic and the impact that it caused. As I said before, I'm a father first, and I know the impact that it had on my kids and on kids in the community. and people, are frustrated about the impact of COVID. But look, one of the first things in March of 2021, the president advocated, pushed for the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan is responsible for the accelerated reopening of our country. We would be talking right now, Katie, about which colleges closed in 2021. We would be talking about which high schools had to close because they didn't have the funding that the American Rescue Plan provided. So I think if you look at the details, you'll see that the actions taken in 2021, when President Biden took office, accelerated the reopening of schools, in particular, of colleges. We kept students whole. We kept all the staff in our schools whole. Imagine the impact on the economy if half of those people got laid off during that first year of office. So I'm proud of the work that we did there, but I recognize the feelings that parents had. I too was disappointed at what my children missed. My daughter was in eighth grade that first year, and she missed all the amazing things that happened at the end of eighth grade. So yeah, there was some, emotion there, and I think that's natural and understandable across the country.
Let's talk about the future of the Department of Education, because as you know, it has been in the crosshairs. President-elect Trump has stated that he wants to dismantle it. In a video he posted in October 2023, he said, one other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a better job of it.
Yeah.
Um, this isn't the first time the DOE has been in the crosshairs. During the Reagan administration, he wanted to shut it down, but Congress said, no, Mr. President, you can't do that. But what is your reaction to all the talk of shutting down the Department of Education and shifting power entirely to the states?
Yeah. Well, I was a state commissioner of education. I was a district leader, and I was a school principal and a classroom teacher. I can tell you right now, the power is in the states. When I was commissioner of education, I knew that it was my responsibility to oversee education. So I think it's misinformation or maybe a lack of understanding of what the role of the Department of Education is from President-elect Trump. But this I shared in the first question the role of the Federal Department of Education to protect the rights of students, to make sure the money gets to the classrooms. But the decisions on curriculum, the decisions on hiring and firing and how schools are set up are state decisions, and they should be. I don't think at the federal level, the Department of Education should be dictating what students are learning, how they're learning it. And I think those decisions are better made at the local level. And I can tell you as a lifelong educator, this is something that I've supported and agree with. So I think part of that was just an effort to create disruption or create division in the education space. The fact that the president-elect said that and saw that that was something that was resonating, to me, it was more of a campaign strategy than it was beliefs around education. I really don't believe there's a good understanding of how education works. To say that it should be at the states shows that, because it is at the states where decisions are made.
Secretary Cardona, what are the risks of shutting down the DOE in your estimation if all the power shifts to the states?
Well, as I said before, our job is to make sure that the all students across the country have access to quality education. So what'll happen is, we have some places where we have to step in to ensure that all students' rights are being protected. In particular, students with disabilities. I can imagine if the Federal Department of Education goes away, that children with disabilities will have less protection. There'll be less oversight, and there'll be some places where poor decisions are going to be made, or dollars that are supposed to go to children with disabilities go to something else, a pet project that someone has. We saw some really poor leadership over the last year, people that were jockeying to try to become the next Secretary of Education and making decisions that really go against, what parents, both Republican and Democrat, want for their children. We would see less oversight in terms of ensuring that students that have additional need get the support that they need. So for me, it's really important that there's someone watching to ensure that students get the support that they need. And I think, I don't want to just harp on the oversight. I want to talk about the support. When we first came in, there was never in the history of our country guidance around providing support for the mental health of our students. We put out that first year, the first guidance ever around how to support the mental health needs of our students because we were hearing about mental health needs. We're in a youth mental health crisis today, Katie. And back in 2021, we were putting out guidance so that every state had the same information, at least to be informed and how to make decisions to support children who are going through a really tough time in this country. So it's not only the oversight and requiring that they follow the law, but it's also providing guidance and support to states that need it, because not every state has the same infrastructure or capacity to have the research that we provide for them or the best practices that we see in other parts of the country.
One aspect of what the Department of Education does is to protect LGBTQ
Right.
students. Can you describe your role in that?
Sure. We have an Office for Civil Rights that really protects the civil rights of students, and it goes far back as to making sure students have access to education regardless of race. We want to make sure that the Office for Civil Rights protects the rights of our girls in our schools to have access to sports and similar education programs that the boys do. It goes that far back. And students that are LGBTQ are also protected to make sure that they're not discriminated against in public education because of them being LGBTQ. So that's something that has really come to the forefront because we see in some states, states going attacking students or ostracizing students and their families and educators for being LGBTQ. So we've really taken the stand that that's unacceptable, that when we're talking about public education, all means all.
Trans people and trans students have become targeted by a lot of conservatives in this country, upset about bathroom bills, for example, or insisting that students use the bathroom coinciding with their gender at birth. And obviously, a lot of controversy about transgender students participating in sports, say a trans
Mhm.
girl participating in girls' sports. Can you talk about that? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation about that floating around too.
I agree with you. I think it's been used to try to wedge members of communities against other members of community. And it saddens me a bit that these students are being used as pawns and, targeted to create division in our country. Look, I told you, I was a school principal and I started like in 2003. And it was my responsibility as a school principal to make sure all kids had access to education. And I had to be respectful of everyone's opinions and of everyone's needs. And there were times where I had to make a decision as a principal, whether it was bathrooms or, even, participation of different events. I had to make a decision that was based best on all students. So the fact that it's become politicized really is an example of, in my opinion, just targeting a group of students and ostracizing them. A group of students that has historically needed more mental health supports because of this. They become politicized, and their families have become politicized at a time in our country where we need unity. Schools unite people. So yes, we're always going to protect all students' ability to have access to public education. And on those things where people don't agree, I really have confidence in educators and local officials to make the best decision for the students and the families and take into account different perspectives, but also at the end of the day, make sure that all students feel welcome and successful in schools.
According to Project 2025 and Trump's Agenda 47, the president would issue an executive order on day one to, quote, fire rogue bureaucrats and replace them with more loyal subjects. Currently, about 4,000 federal positions are appointed by the president. The new plan would increase that number to 50,000. Can you discuss what proposals Project 2025 outlines for the Department of Education and your feeling about those?
Yeah, that sounds more like a monarchy to me. We have civil servants that serve here at the Department of Education, and they serve America's students regardless of who the Secretary of Education is. And it's their job not to be partisan. It's their job to serve students and to follow what Congress has passed. And there's a reason we have the majority of the employees here are civil servants. We have a small number of people that are appointed by President Biden during this administration, me being one of them. And when there's a transition and we leave, and those who were appointed by President Biden leave, it's critical that the services of the Department of Education continue. That's more subject to change if the majority of the people come in with the president. It doesn't really, to me, strike a balance of taking politics out of education. So I worry about that. I worry about someone coming in and wanting unilateral authority to do whatever he or she wants. This beautiful country was developed with checks and balances, and it's really important. And I say this as a Secretary of Education. It's really important that we have folks here that have diverse perspective, because I'm not a Democratic Secretary of Education. I'm the Secretary of Education for all students, including students whose parents and families come from different political ideologies than I do, or disagree with some of the policies that I come forward with. For me, that's un-American, that's undemocratic, and it's quite frankly pretty scary, because we do not live in a monarchy. We have a democratic government, and it's worked. And this is why, countries, when I visit and I talk to ministers of education from all over the world, they envy what we're doing here. Our colleges are the envy of colleges all over the world. We cannot tinker with that to make it a dictatorship. And I worry about what I read in Project 2025, and eliminating the Department of Education and some of the other really things that would take our country, in my opinion, backwards. And it's pretty scary to think that this is the playbook that came out during the election season, and one that the president-elect said he didn't know about, and now it looks very similar to the agenda that he has moving forward. Look, to me, moving forward, to be honest with you, we got to stop taking the politics out of education. And I say this both for Democrats and Republicans. Let's just focus on kids. Let's work together. Let's disagree respectfully, because our kids are watching, and let's work together to a more perfect union. And that means that we have to take into account what the voters have asked for, but also do so in a way that protects these institutions, that their job is to make sure that education, public education in this country continues for all students. And we can have differences of opinions, but it's really important that we show the country that we could work together to serve students.
You mentioned political ideology, and I think there is also an undercurrent of anger that some voters apparently feel that somehow students are being indoctrinated with sort of a woke ideology, whether it's critical race theory
Right.
or gender identity issues. And I'm curious if you could speak to that and
Sure.
separate fact from fiction and what's going on in classrooms across the country.
Those were campaign strategies, Katie. I'm going to be very frank with you. I have less say on what my children learn in the classroom now than I did when I was a classroom teacher. Every position I've had before Secretary of Education, I've had more authority to control the curriculum than I do now. So that's all misinformation. And I think it was done in an attempt to create dissonance, and really get people to believe something that's not accurate. So a lot of it was misinformation intended to create division in our schools. I do not control curriculum. In terms of indoctrination, I think the closest thing we've seen to that is we have some states, buying Bibles for every student in their school. I mean, and I'm a Christian. I'm a God-fearing man. I was raised Christian and still practice and have strong faith. Faith has really driven me so much. And I don't talk a lot about it, but I know that I'm following God's plan, and it's not my plan. I really can get into that. But I do believe in the separation of church and state. So when I see those who are saying that we're indoctrinating students, doing some of the things that really, align with indoctrination, I get baffled, but I never bet against America's schools and America's educators and parents to really separate fact from fiction, and see what's happening. There is no indoctrination. There's a lot of misinformation. I was at an event recently, and I saw a friend of mine from high school. True story. He told me that his mother believed when it was said that, you send your kid to school as a boy and then comes back 3 days later as a girl, and they changed them, and they didn't know why. She believed that. And this person that was telling me that said, you got to talk to my mom. I don't know how the hell she believes that. That's wild. But yet she believes it because she hears it being said. And that to me is more of a political strategy than it is talking about education policy. And it was done to get people to believe what they hear. It's sad that it's gotten to that point of such misinformation, direct lies being shared openly. There was a time where no party would ever stoop to that level of spreading lies just to get people to believe you so that you could vote a certain way. I have confidence that our local educators and our local parents work well together, and they're going to continue to evolve education to make sure that our students' needs are being met. But it saddened me how much misinformation was being spread with the intention of dividing our communities for a vote.
Well, when it comes to sort of educating kids about gender identity, are there certain guidelines or is it decided at the state and local level?
State and local level. I have not had any conversations in my time as Secretary of Education of how to teach any of that. As a matter of fact, I have not even weighed in on that. My personal beliefs or my beliefs as a lifelong educator with degrees in education has never been heard on an airwave about how to teach that intentionally, because it's really important that I delineate that that's not my role as Secretary of Education.
Do you
Um,
think that state and local districts have handled that responsibly? Has any of these methodologies given you pause or
I've spoken to families in some communities where they feel like I had one where they've had to hide. They had to feel almost ashamed of saying who they are, who they love. I had teachers tell me that they had to hide pictures of their family in the classroom because of the attacks on the LGBTQ community. So to me, that's an extreme where I shouldn't have to hear from teachers or students that have to hide who they are, or part of their identity, um, because they don't want to be attacked. We've normalized in some parts of our country attacking or ostracizing people who are different than us. That's going backwards as America. That's going backwards. So I'm not pleased. As a matter of fact, I think some places have gotten it wrong. I think some leaders, state leaders, have taken an extreme perspective so that they could be looked on favorably by President-elect Trump. And I think they've done that to the detriment of many students in their communities that they're hired to serve and hired to support.
many people are saying Linda McMahon, who has been tapped to be the new Secretary of Education, has limited experience in education. I guess she was on the board in Connecticut. You can help me with this, I
Mhm.
guess, of a college. Wasn't she on the
Correct.
board?
She's on the board of a local college in Connecticut.
But she's
And she was
never,
on the State Board of Education also for a period of time um, in Connecticut. I can't think of the years off the top of my head, but she has served on the State Board of Education, and she, I believe, served recently, or maybe is still serving on a college Board of Trustees or Board of Governors.
but I think it's safe to say her experience in education is somewhat limited. So, how do you feel about someone with Linda McMahon's background running the Department of Education? And do you think this is going to lead to the dismantling of the department?
I'd be very frank with you, and this is the first time I've spoken about this. I wish her well. I remember coming in as a Secretary of Education, and there was a lot to learn. it's such a tremendous responsibility. There are 50 million students in the K-12 system, another 15 to 17 million in college. And, it's such an important responsibility to make sure that all students have access to quality education. So I wish her well, and I certainly want to make sure that she knows that I'm available to support her transition in. I have concerns about the policies that President-elect Trump has communicated openly about the Department of Education. I worry about what I saw in Project 2025 and what it could translate into the policies as president. And I recognize the great work that the thousands of people that work at the Department of Education do on a daily basis to ensure public education and access to higher education across the country. That's more important than any person that's sitting in this chair, including me. That mission to serve America's students and families is more important than anyone sitting in this chair or in the president's chair. And I take that very seriously, and I know she will too. I worry about the policies that I'm hearing from the Trump administration. Do I believe that you can come in on day one, close the Department of Education? Look, I expect Congress to do their job and protect the Department of Education and the important work that the Department of Education does to protect students with disabilities, to protect students whose civil rights have been violated, to ensure higher education access is possible. Millions of families get access to federal aid and can go to college. I was a first-generation college student myself, Katie. And if it weren't for public education and access to higher education, I wouldn't be sitting here as Secretary of Education. So education is the great equalizer, and it's the important role of the Secretary of Education to protect that for all students.
I wanted to ask you about student debt
Yes.
forgiveness as well. What is the status of that? And I know it sort of has not been completed. It's been
Right.
criticized by many people as saying that it's unfair and a lot of people don't support it, but obviously it's
Sure.
helping out a lot of families. So can you give us a status report about what's going on with student debt forgiveness?
Absolutely. And let me take a step back. We have a broken higher education funding system where you have to almost be born into wealth to have access to higher education. Or if you're not born into wealth, you're going to have debt for the rest of your life if you want to invest in yourself and get an education. That's where we are, right? So we set out to fix that and repair a broken system. And I'm proud of the work that we've done. When the airline industry is falling, federal government puts billions of dollars to prop it up and fix it. When the bank industry is on the brink of collapse, the federal government comes in and supports it and fixes it. The higher education funding system is broken. The federal government came in and said, we're going to fix it. And we're hearing from folks who oppose our plans all this opposition when we're talking about teachers who have $200,000 in debt, not because they took out $200,000 in loans, but because they took out a loan with the interest rate that made the debt balloon. We have police officers who have lifetimes of debt because they chose to get a degree to help them be better officers. We're fixing that unapologetically, Katie. We've provided for about 5 million Americans over $170 billion in debt relief. And that includes students who were preyed upon by for-profit colleges that tell them they're going to get a degree and make so much money, but they never deliver. But these students are left with $70,000, $80,000 in debt. I'm proud of that work. We're increasing accountability in the higher education space too, Katie. It's not just debt forgiveness. It's making sure that there's a better return on investment. And you know what else we're doing? We're increasing pathways to careers where you don't need a 4-year degree. For far too long in this country, it's been a 4-year college or bust mentality. I'm a trade school graduate, high school graduate. I learned how to fix cars for 4 years. And that there's dignity in working in the trades and getting a credential and being able to help rebuild the infrastructure that we're going to be rebuilding in this country, helping make things here in America. We've created pathways to high-paying, high-skilled careers that people can graduate without a 4-year degree and make $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year with dignity. So we're evolving higher education access, affordability, and giving students pathways to continue to, maybe a 4-year degree is not their end goal, but they could still contribute to the growth of our country. President Biden has done more in that space in the last 4 years than at any other time in my 25-year history as an educator. I'm proud of that. The mischaracterization of that bothers me because there's so many kids in this country that want to go to college, but by middle school say, I can't afford it, so I'm out. Imagine the potential we're losing in this country because there are talented kids who weren't born into wealth. That's not fair. And no, you shouldn't, as a school teacher or a nurse, have to pay for the rest of your life because you wanted to help your community. That's unacceptable. We're proud of public service loan forgiveness. We're proud of the work that we're doing to increase federal aid, the Pell Grants, so that, kids across our country could see college as an option. That to me is how you grow a country. And I'm proud of the work we've done over the last 4 years there.
I'm curious about the issue of school choice and how that might impact the quality of public education in this country.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. As I said before, I say it, I'm a father before I'm a secretary, and I get to choose, my wife and I get to choose what's best for my children. And I stand by that. So if I choose to send my child to a private school, or I choose to send my child to a parochial school or to a private charter school, that's my right as a parent. I have no qualms with that.
But doesn't that drain money from public
Well,
school
right.
education?
So I have no problem with parents choosing. As a matter of fact, I'm a product of school choice. I went to a technical high school. I didn't go to my local high school. I went to learn a trade. I'm fine with that. However, where I draw the line is where we start paying for some of those private tuitions with public school dollars.
With
Our,
vouchers.
yes, our local public schools where teachers are paid 26% less than people with similar degrees in other professions cannot afford to take the dollars that we're spending to help children with disabilities have access, or children who are reading below grade level to have access to a quality education. I shouldn't be taking those dollars to pay for a private school tuition. That's unacceptable. So I'm totally fine with choice. I draw the line when we start taking public education dollars to pay for private vouchers. That's unacceptable. And that's happening across the country. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, it's a strategy to gut the public schools of funding so that they look like a bad option, so that your private schools become the desired alternative, so that we could monetize education. Kind of like for-profit institutions in higher education, I believe there's a strategy to privatize a public good, which is public education. So we're going to create a system, Katie, of winners and losers. Kids who have access to dollars or advocacy or good lawyers who are going to get the seats in the prestigious private schools, and then everybody's left over in the public school that's underfunded because those dollars were used to pay for the tuitions. It's a system of haves and have-nots. It would be taking our country backward, and it would not be meeting the needs of all of our students, in particular, students with disabilities, in particular, students with special needs or students that are high risk. Because it costs more to educate a child with disabilities. It costs more to educate a child who's struggling in school. So if your goal is to make a profit, then you don't want to educate those kids that cost more to educate. It's pretty simple.
You mentioned states that are changing laws or changing policies, like Oklahoma, where the state school superintendent is basically requiring Bible studies to be
Yeah.
taught in public schools. In Louisiana, the 10 Commandments must be posted in every public school classroom. Texas has made similar moves.
Right.
And it does seem to be a violation of the separation of church and state, but there are conservatives in this country who believe that Christian values should be an integral part of public education. And I'd love to hear your reaction to
Sure.
that.
The Bible says, love thy neighbor. It doesn't say love thy cisgender neighbor. So,
Or love thy Christian neighbor.
right, right. Exactly. So to me, I categorize that as people auditioning for the role of Secretary of Education. And making a farce of their role, just to be on the good list of President-elect Trump. And it really, it didn't help instill confidence in education leadership, which is such an important role in this country. Um, I'm, as I said before, I'm Christian, and I have Christian values, and it's my faith that really has guided the work that I do here. However, I respect that there are different faiths out there, and the beauty of this country is that unlike many other countries, we promote the different perspectives, and we respect the different perspectives and different faiths, and we can do that under one flag. That's the beauty of this country. So the extremism that we see in some places, if anything, it's un-American. And again, I say that with respect to my Christian colleagues who should know that the separation of church and state is there for a reason, and all students should feel welcome in our schools. And the most Christian thing you can do as a Christian leader is show your faith by your actions, and excluding students or making them feel less than is certainly an unchristian thing to do, and it's an un-American thing to do too.
I often read that in terms of global rankings, the United States is not doing very well
Right.
when it comes to things like math and science and other, I guess, measures of academic
Sure.
success. How concerned are you that we're falling behind other countries around the world?
Yeah, I'm very concerned, and which is why I'm proud that the president put more funding to address those issues than any other president in the history of our country. It's no mistake, it's no coincidence that from 2022 to 2023, we've seen the highest growth in Black students in reading that we have seen since 2009, because we've invested in an area of need. So yes, we need to do better. Our country should be number one in all rankings. But until we invest the way other countries do, we're going to see what we see. Look, we all want Finland results, but very few are willing to put in the Finland investments. I've spoken to the Minister of Education there. I've spoken to the Minister of Education in Singapore. They invest in their educators, they invest in their system, and the product is better results.
They invest in their teachers too, don't they?
Absolutely. Our teachers, there are, I think, over 30 states where teachers qualify for state assistance. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable that teachers have to normalize working as a bartender on the weekends or driving Uber to make ends meet so their children could go to college. That's unacceptable. Until we get until we get angry about that to the point where we start lifting the profession the way it should be, we're going to start seeing that our students are not performing at the level they can. And then when we're saying we're going to take public education dollars out of those already cash-strapped schools and pay for vouchers for private schools, for elite, we're going backwards. So, to me, the outcomes of our education system is a reflection of, number one, the lack of importance in many places in our country around education. We have a president that's talking about closing the Department of Education, where in other countries, they invest in education. They recognize the importance of lifting up standards, of making sure that there's adequate supports for our students with disabilities. You can't expect results if you're thinking about dismantling a Department of Education. To me, it just doesn't make sense. And it almost sounds silly talking about it, because you can ask any teacher across the country, any paraeducator, and they'll tell you, because they're in the classrooms. You you get what you pay for. If you don't want to invest in education, don't expect best results in the world. Now, President Biden, Vice President Harris has invested in education over the last 4 years, and we saw growth that we hadn't seen in decades. That tells me that we know what to do. Educators know what to do. Education leaders know what to do. We need to start investing in education as if our country depends on it, because Haiti, it does.
A lot of people asked us about the burnout and turnover among public school
Right.
teachers, Mr. Secretary, and the fact that there are many people who are fleeing the profession altogether.
Yeah.
What words of encouragement can you offer public school teachers who are probably looking at the next 4 years
Yeah.
with uh, a pretty high degree of trepidation?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate that because I get a chance to talk to my colleagues out there. My message to them is pretty straightforward. Our kids need you now more than ever. Just like I said 4 years ago when the pandemic hit, it's a tough time. There was no playbook for reopening schools during a pandemic, but you did it. And you did it with grace. You did it with dignity. You took care of your own personal needs, your family's needs, and your students. And I'm just in awe, Katie, of our educators across the country. Here we are again. Our kids need us now more than ever. Our institutions need us now more than ever. We need to build confidence in our education system. And I never bet against America's schools or teachers or educators. But we need you now more than ever. And we've worked really hard, Katie, because if you recall, 4 years ago, there was a teacher shortage. And I say the teacher shortage is a symptom of a teacher respect issue. We fought and we worked with governors, we worked with state legislators, red and blue states. It doesn't matter to me. And over 35 states have increased teacher salaries. We went, student teachers, like teaching is the only profession where you have to work for 4 months for free before you get into the profession. And then we wonder why there's a shortage. Student teachers don't get paid. But we worked in 2021 when we started, there were 0 states that had paid teacher internships. Today, we have over 46 states that have paid teacher internships. We've worked hard with states to make the profession more attractive. We put funding, President Biden put funding in there to make sure that we're providing support for our educators. This is the best profession at a time where our kids need us the most. It is a great time to get into the profession. And yes, we're going to continue to fight for the dignity and respect that we deserve. But at the end of the day, we serve children and we're helping the next generation of American leaders develop their skills, man. There's no better profession, Katie. I'll say this in the beginning of my time as secretary, and I feel it even more strongly now. Teaching is the best profession to make a difference in this country. And I encourage folks who are wondering, and I've spoken to people who have gone and made money in other professions who want to get into teaching because they want to make a difference. This is the best profession. We need to support our educators. We need to lift them up, see them for what they're doing in this country. And for us, that means paid internships. That means public service loan forgiveness for educators who choose public service, not to make millions, but to make their community better. This is the best time to get into the profession. I encourage educators to remember who you serve and remember what you do for this country.
Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
It was an honor to spend time with you today, Katie. Thank you.